you. Good morning. My name is Sam Gresham, and I'm with Common Cause. We're happy to have you here this morning with our press conference to begin the process of initiating redistricting in Ohio. As you are clearly aware, every 10 years, Congress requires that we redistrict based on the populations that exist in our state and make those adjustments based on those populations. This year, we are initiating a new process as a result of the strong support that we received in the community. And two initiatives, we had over 70% support, plus support in those communities. So it provides a strong wind at our back to get ready. We'd like to get to work for make the many important things work. We have to figure out how to make the process work best given the constraints and to create a sensible strategy and timelines for map making. But most important in this, we need to find a way to make the community the center of the process. Make sure the community is totally involved with this process at its inception and its conclusion. For this morning, we have for you Jen Miller from the League of Women Voters. We have Catherine Turcer from Common Cause, and we have Jessie Hill, who is an attorney from Case Western Reserve. We'll start off with Jen Miller, who is the executive director of League of Women Voters. Jen? Jen? You're muted. You're muted.
I know I'm muted. I was sending a link to Laura Bischoff of the Dayton Daily News, and then I couldn't get back to my Zoom to unmute myself. So I apologize.
All right.
Happy Monday to all of you. The sun is shining. It feels a lot more hopeful than it did last year at this time when it was just rain, rain, rain. And we really didn't know all that was ahead of us, but we knew it was scary. So just so honored to be with all of you. Thank you, Sam. This morning, we sent a letter to the redistricting commissioners we know. So Governor DeWine, Auditor Keith Faber, and Secretary of State Frank LaRose, as well as all the members of the Ohio General Assembly, really talking about the redistricting process and timeline as is. So given that we have this once in a decade opportunity for fair voter-focused maps, we want to make sure that the process continues to move forward in a way that is transparent, that involves lots of public input, and that should not be limited because of changes to the census timeline. We all know that Ohioans want fair maps. As Sam mentioned, we've been working on this issue for a long time, and Ohioans, Republican, Democrat, urban, rural, exurban, across the state from Lake Erie to the Ohio River, all ages, all races want fair maps. And so what will we do now that we're seeing that the census timeline has changed? First off, rushing data and could make bad data makes bad maps. And so we are saying, let's all work together now. The compromises for 2015 and 2018 really brought all of us together across stakeholders to create better processes. It's time for that same sense of collaboration now as we look at this new timeline. So the first things we are asking the Ohio map makers to do is explore holding a June primary. One of the things we don't want to have happen is to replicate the primary of last year, where stakeholders did not discuss the needs that various folks had, and April 28th became quite a difficult timeline for voters and boards of elections. We're suggesting a June timeline. It gives us a June primary, it gives us a little extra time, but we think that we should be setting that sooner rather than later. And we need to consider all the key stakeholders, like local school districts, like elections officials, like various candidates, as well as the voters. We call for the distribution of the funds that have already been budgeted for the Ohio House and Senate caucuses. That could be used now for research and planning and training. We call that we believe that the Legislative Service Commission should be directed to establish a website now where the public could read up on the process. It could also hold all the various testimony. They could follow the hearings. That's where any data that would be used for mapping could be housed. And it could have a portal to submit maps themselves to be considered. We call on the legislative leaders to announce, finalize and announce their legislative appointments for the Ohio Redistricting Commission, because those seats are still open. We call for the budget to include adequate funds for the Ohio's 88 boards of elections. Let's remember that once the maps are done, they actually need to place folks into the right districts, and they need to educate voters that they have new districts. We think there should be public hearings now. There's no reason to wait for public hearings, especially because there are, political scientists and mapping and data and legal experts, as well as voting rights experts, who could really shed light on a lot of the issues that we need to discuss in terms of maps or consider in terms of map making, as well as hearing from that general public. And so, those hearings should talk about an adjusted timeline. They should talk about complying with federal laws like the Voting Rights Act and equal population, as well as these new laws in our Constitution and how to best comply with those, both the letter and the spirit of those constitutional amendments. We need to figure out how to maximize public participation and make sure that the public have what they need so that they can follow the process and participate as they like. And one thing I just want to say is we want to start having hearings now. That does not supplant having hearings later where Ohioans can weigh in once maps are proposed. But right now, there's so much that we could be talking about. This is a highly technical process. It's a process that only happens every 10 years. So while some lawmakers or some redistricting commissioners were around last time, they may, first off, they need to dust off their cobwebs, but we also have a lot of new players. That includes, a lot of new reporters, new advocates. And so it's really important that we start these conversations now to set ourselves up for success. And again, none of this should supplant the chance for the public to actually be participating once we do have accurate quality data from the Census Bureau. It is my honor to now introduce Jessie Hill. She is a professor of law at Case Western. She's a civil rights attorney, also works, has a lot of specialization in the Constitution and the First Amendment. And she's going to just talk to us about how it is absolutely reasonable for the state at this point to be rethinking timelines and how that could be done. Jessie?
Thank you so much, Jen. Yeah, as I'm speaking here as someone who is not directly involved in this process, so I'm not working directly with the organizations represented here. I am just sort of playing the role of an independent expert to let you know that in my view, and as a professor of constitutional law and civil rights law, and as an attorney, that it is there is clearly here a legal and reasonable way forward, and that deadlines are something that can be modified in the case of an emergency type of situation like what we have here, or an unexpected development in terms of the availability of the data that was not foreseen at the time that the deadlines were put in place, and that in courts certainly have the power to modify deadlines that are set in law. So, if it's impossible to meet a deadline, or if it's if meeting a deadline would undermine the spirit of the law, the purpose of the law, and other important interests like fair voting and voters' rights and sort of a democratic system, of course, it's possible to modify and to come up with an alternative plan. And it can require perhaps, or it can be wise to involve a court in that process. That's not out of the question, but certainly courts have the ability to modify any sorts of limitations or deadlines that are in even the Ohio Constitution in order to meet these overarching, more important goals. So that is the main point I wanted to make about all of this, is that there's no reason to think that the law has to stand in the way. This is actually a way of supporting legal requirements, voting rights, fair districting, and that this process should be able to move forward as is being outlined here. So at this point, I just want to turn it over then to Catherine Turcer, who is the Executive Director of Common Cause Ohio.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. So I am so excited that we finally have gotten to 2021 and we're getting to the map making. I think as we're looking ahead and thinking about a sensible timeline, we should remember the voters and we should remember kind of the long path to get to the new reforms that we're implementing this year. And because voters, overwhelmingly supported redistricting reform. So in both 2015 and 2018, more than 70% of the voters supported redistricting reform. They supported the new rules, including transparency and the rules that rein in the worst aspects of gerrymandering. And, redistricting reform actually won in all 88 counties. So I want to just highlight, voters are going into this. They are expecting that it's going to be different this year and that we're going to have fair maps. And yet, it's very hard to have fair maps if you don't have good data. And so what we want to be really clear about is that, yes, the census has had to change and adjust their timeline. And that means that we actually have to think through how we are going to do map making in Ohio. And yes, the pandemic has been a hassle and we've had to make all sorts of adjustments. And this is just one more. And we just need to come up with a good, sensible timeline. And to do that, I think generally laid out, we need to hear from the public. We need to hear from experts. We need to understand, as one of the possibilities is changing the primary date. And so we need to hear from Board of Election officials, and we need to hear from the public, and we need to hear from candidates. And so this is a real opportunity to do some crowdsourcing and come up with a good, sensible, timeline for the official map making. And, with that, I think, I'd like to highlight one more thing, which is, this is all about us, because, fair districts equal fair election. So which means that we have good public policy. Like at the end of the day, we are laying the groundwork for the next 10 years. And so let's make sure we do this right, because this is for the next 10 years. And with that, I'm going to hand it to Sam, and it'll be time for questions. Sam?
All right, thank you. Thank you very much, Catherine. Thank you very much, Elise. And thank you very much, Jess. I would ask each reporter to acknowledge who they are, what publication they've come from, and who they're directing the questions to. We are now open to questions.
Hi guys, Julie Carr-Smythe at the Associated Press. What is the problem with the things you've laid out, and why don't you think it's going to happen, or why do you think it's so important to emphasize it? What's standing in the way?
Julie, I don't know if anything is standing in the way. We have always been the nonpartisan redistricting thought leaders. And so this is our chance to kind of help the General Assembly and the Redistricting Commission think through. We have a conundrum here. The change timeline, it does put stress and strain on all the various stakeholders. And so this is our chance of suggesting that we get started and what we get started on.
Next question.
Yeah, this is Andrew Tobias at Cleveland.com and the Plain Dealer. And I was just wondering what you guys, in light of the federal judge dismissing the Attorney General's census lawsuit, and it's pending an appeal right now. So I would just be interested in what you guys think the general legal landscape is when it comes to that issue.
Do you want to take that, Jessie?
So are you, as for clarification, are you talking about in Ohio, like what's likely to happen next and where do things stand with that?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And again, as somebody, I just want to clarify, I was not directly involved in it. My understanding is there's a possibility of appeal from that decision still. But also right now, the federal judge dismissed the state of Ohio's lawsuit asking the Census Bureau to basically do the impossible, right? And sort of squeeze blood from a turnip or something like that, to do something they couldn't do. That was an entirely reasonable decision from the federal court. Like I said, I think that could still, the litigation could still continue from there if there is an appeal. But I don't see that as having any impact legally on what we are discussing here today. It would be an entirely separate set of issues. This is, as a matter of fact, it's kind of what we're saying here today is that you can't expect people to legally do what is impossible or unreasonable to do. So yeah, but it's an entirely separate legal issue.
Andrew, I think I would like to jump into, here's one of the things, right? We know that the data is delayed. The Census Bureau has said the reason is because COVID has created some challenges in having accurate data. Let's keep in mind that bad data makes bad maps, but also this data is the formula for so many other things that make our communities run, right? So it's the formula for transportation planning, for emergency services, for free school lunches. We cannot afford to rush that data. So our point here today is to say, let's not wait. Let's go ahead and start having conversations. Let's figure out where we might be able to cut down some time. So for example, OU's contract is 2 months. Maybe we can do that a little more efficiently, right? Maybe we need to look at how much money the boards of elections need and actually have hearings to hear from them, because maybe with more money, they could put folks, do that back end piece once the maps are done in a more efficient time frame. So our point here is rushing data for the sake of rushing data hurts Ohio in the map making process, but could hurt our communities in many other ways. So instead, let us start where we can start and figure out how we can work together to make great maps with the new timeline.
Next question.
Shane Stegmiller with Hannah News Service. Are you guys worried that with the census delaying its numbers, that's going to be used as an excuse to kind of do business as usual, kind of create maps the way we always used to do it, kind of gerrymander things in a kind of a rushed fashion? Or what are your kind of concerns with this delayed data and what could happen with it, and why you're saying get started now?
Well, I always think about that gerrymander cartoon that went back to 1812, that for years and years, map makers have been thinking about how to manipulate those districts. And it's very hard to give that up. It's very hard to move on and have new rules. And so, of course, when there is an adjusted timeline, we could see some possibility of some shenanigans. And so we need to be very clear from today on, what we want is to make sure that this process is as public as possible, and that there is engagement built with the public and with experts. As we go through this entire year and beyond, because we're talking about getting to the 2022 primaries, that we create as public a process as possible, and there's time for public deliberation and input.
And Shane, let's keep in mind one thing that is very different than before is that the Ohio public has weighed in. Again, let's just say this, and let's remind all those commissioners and map makers in the Ohio General Assembly that what is most different is that Ohio voters now understand map making. They understand how redistricting can affect their daily lives. They, on all sides of this issue, you know, all political ideologies in all 88 counties have affirmed that they want something different. And so this is our chance to remind them what voters want, which is collaboration, bipartisanship, transparency, public participation, and that, you know, these timelines, though changed, should not get in the way of us upholding the letter and spirit of those reforms. And we can start now so that that doesn't happen.
And if I could just add one quick thing from a legal perspective too, is that if this isn't used as an excuse, the delay in the data to create maps that are not going to pass muster under the Voting Rights Act or other federal law, that's not going to be an excuse. In other words, they're not going to be able to use it as an excuse later on that we didn't have good data and therefore we drew really bad maps that violate federal law if they could have gotten good data. So it's just another reason why they should want to agree to really rethink the plan.
Shane, this is Sam. I want to add, remember, these initiatives passed in all 88 counties. And that's a lot of people who are interested in this process. So more questions, please.
Hi, this is Dustin Ensinger with Gongor News Service. I was wondering how you guys landed on June for a primary next year.
Oh, Dustin, boy, oh boy, oh boy. And this is why we don't have the full date in there, but I and Catherine, and others spent a lot of time talking to all the various stakeholders along the way. And we were trying to figure out how, you know, what everyone needed to succeed, and not just for the maps, right? We're also voter advocates. So we need to also be making sure that whatever happens here doesn't harm voters in terms of timelines for either the primary or the general. So our idea of June is simply, and again, we didn't say a date because we're actually saying to the map makers, hold hearings so that we can discuss a date, you know, but we're thinking it should be in June because, and much later, it becomes difficult for local communities that may have levies, or difficult for the boards of elections to do all that they need to do to prepare for the fall election. Let's keep in mind that the UACAVA process, so thinking about serving our military voters overseas, that starts really far out, as does our incredibly great other systems like early voting. So June seemed to be as far back as we could get it without harming stakeholders farther down the line.
Well, I want to throw in this, you know, we had a change in our primary in 2020, and it really threw us for a loop. I don't know, like there was that thing on St. Patrick's Day of last year where I was like, what is happening? How is this going to work? And what we don't want is that thing of like, okay, so, you know, Secretary of State throws out a possibility and another person throws out a possibility. What we want is for a process to be established so that the decision-making is thorough, the public understands it, is engaged and informed. So, and the Board of Election officials especially have an opportunity to weigh in.
Yeah, so just to follow back up on that, I think that's great. So Dustin, we at the voter advocates really understood and supported the idea last year of closing the polls on March 17th. But what we did not like was all of this back and forth and this jockeying and this picking of dates that did not really think about the needs of various stakeholders. And what we're saying to the state of Ohio more than anything is we have to do that. Ultimately, that April 28th date was really hard on elections officials and voters. And so we're saying, let us be mindful. You know, there are things right now that we can discuss that have nothing to do with census data, like how the VRA should be applied. I mean, they do, but there's the technical pieces of this, the legal pieces of this that we could be discussing now in very public ways and hearing from experts in the public alike. But there are these other things that we should just be deciding. You know, one thing that I know from our election official friends, and I believe this too for voter advocates, is that kind of reactive short timelines is much harder than just getting something set, which is part of the reason why we're saying let's have hearings to get something set, and then let's figure out the process for making it work and when it comes to redistricting.
All right, more questions, please.
It's Shane again. I mean, next year's not a presidential year. They're not holding it in March. I mean, what does June give you that May's not going to already give you for a primary?
So Shane, I think that's a great question. Here's the thing. We are we have about 4 months different in our timeline. And so when we were looking at it, every day, every week can make a difference in terms of transparency and public participation. So we're definitely, a lot of this is going to have to be during the process where we consider how to really do this efficiently. And so we're talking about, some of it is creating space for this process by setting a slightly later primary, but there's other things, right? Like we're talking, you know, we suggest starting the state legislative map making and the congressional legislative map making at the same time. The way it is in the initial calendar is you do the state and then you do congressional. If we do them at the same time, we can actually, that might be great for advocates too, or experts. So like Jessie, for example, could decide to come down from Cleveland and actually testify on both at the same time. So we're suggesting a lot of different ways to be flexible with the new timeline. And that's just one piece of it.
All right, other stimulating questions.
Yeah, this is Andrew Tobias again. The judge in dismissing the Attorney General's lawsuit said that something that Ohio had available to it was using other data that phrase appears in the Constitution. I was wondering what you guys think about the possibility that state lawmakers may look at using some other data, and what you think the consequences of something like that might be.
Jessie, do you want to take that?
Well, I mean, so I'll say what I want to say, but I think that I want to let the other folks talk about what the specific problems with using that other data are. But I will just say that in a situation like this, when the other sources of data are clearly going to lead to an inferior result, and again, end up undermining important democratic interests and potentially undermining voting rights as well, that is not a path that legally has to be taken.
And I wanted to say, sometimes people are like, well, there's the American Community Survey, that ACS, that's done by the Census, so we know it's reputable data. The thing to think about is that data is a little bit like a watercolor versus the decennial census, which is more like an ink drawing. So you're talking about the difference between a sense of what things are like and actually a much more complete picture. And so, as we think about how to do this appropriately, we should be thinking about starting with the best data that we can get, and then thinking about how are we going to build in the time to do that. June is a possible, move the primary to June. Is it possible to meet all the needs and move it later? Like, what actually makes, what makes sense in this process, and how do we build in public deliberation and hear from experts on voting rights and all of the different, things that the map makers will need.
Hey guys, Julie again. So what is your take on why Davios filed that lawsuit? Was there a purpose out there politically to make a statement on it that could be used, for example, to default to this 4-year option under our new system? And isn't that sort of less bipartisan than the 10-year?
it's hard for me to pretend to be someone else and know why they do things. I'm sorry, Julie. I don't know if anyone else wants to say anything. Jessie, if you have thoughts.
Right. I mean, I think that's the problem. It's hard to speculate. I mean, I think what you just proposed is quite possible. You know, I think, yeah, I think it was odd. It was an oddly framed lawsuit from a legal perspective. I will say that. So I guess, you know, that it may be something more in the political realm was driving it. I'll say that. But other than that, I don't, yeah, it's hard to speculate.
Thanks.
This is Anna from the Columbus Dispatch. Is one of the reasons for pushing back the primary that it pushes back the filing deadline, correct? Is that sort of the main, that you give boards of elections like another month?
Yeah, so exactly. We should, having more time with the filing deadline also gives more time, not just to make the maps, but to then do all the back end that needs to happen so that voters are in the right districts when they go to the primary, and time for voters to learn who their new representatives are.
Yeah, I think that's actually an important part, that like one of the pieces that sometimes when you think of that time frame that people aren't thinking about is that the Board of Elections, yes, you have to get the candidate filings with, you know, the appropriate number of signatures, but also they have to figure out, okay, the people of this specific address are in specific congressional district 15. Oh, and their neighbor, who's just a little while over, are in a different congressional district. That can be a little bit complicated. Clearly, it's going to be more complicated, for example, in more urban counties, but it does take time, even without gerrymandering. It does take time to make sure that the voters are in the correct districts. And so we do need to build in adequate time for that.
I also think you have to add another thing. This is a new process for voters. And it's important to us that voters are at the center of the process and that there's a great deal of transparency. So marketing efforts will be different, how we approach this, because we see it as a new process and as a new day for voters in Ohio. So we need to have adequate time to get that messaging out and to increase the participation of as many citizens as we can. Other questions? Is that the end of it? Well, if I can bring it to an end, thank you for coming this evening. To some of my friends that I know and to others I'm getting to know, thank you for coming. I think it's important that you walk away from this press conference understanding this is a new day. This is a new process. This is not status quo that we had a few years ago. If from these organizations' perspective, we want to message that and increase as much participation as possible. We expect some of the same attempts by the elected officials to do what they are going to do. And that's the nature of that. We have to do what we're going to do to protect the vote and increase the transparency so that we get fair districts. Remember, the voter says 70%, and this passed in every county. So we have a great burden to put out a product that everybody likes, okay? And we take that responsibility seriously. Thank you for joining us. If you have no more questions, have a good morning.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everybody. Thanks for joining us.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.